Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining our event with I.M.A.M tonight, titled Spiritual Abuse, Understanding and Healing as a Community. My name is Melanie, and I'm a graduate student in Islamic Studies, and I have two very special guests here today. First, I would like to introduce Sister Berak. Sister Berak Hussain is a registered psychotherapist in a Canadian university practicing in Canada for over 13 years, and she's also known as a Muslim counselor, and she speaks on a variety of Islamic and psychological issues, bridging the connection and misconceptions around Islam and mental health. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Berak. And next, I would also like to introduce Shaykh Faiyaz. Shaykh Faiyaz Jaffer, he's a research scholar and chaplain at the Islamic Center at New York University. He's also a doctoral candidate at NYU School of Education, and he's published many of his articles in various academic journals, and he's also been classically trained in the seminary of Karbala. So tonight, because our topic is sensitive and may cause some triggers for some of our audience members, for those who may be feeling triggered, we would ask to speak for you to speak with mental health professionals in their area. And I wanted to jump right into the panel discussion tonight, just so that we can be mindful of the time. And just to any audience members who have any questions, feel free to drop that in, and we're going to be doing public questions at the end for the audience. So my first question, I'm going to ask this to Shaykh Faiyaz first. What is spiritual abuse? And this is a question on my mind whenever, when we first began to think of this topic. What even is spiritual abuse? How would you define that? And how does that maybe, how is that distinct from what we would just define as abuse?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your question. And I think that's a good place for us to start naturally. But I think even prior to answering that question, to sort of begin answering the question with a little bit of background. And that is that we believe that the human being has various different components to them. There is, of course, a physical manifestation of the human being, which is the physical body that God has blessed us with. This is the body that grows in age, that grows in height, that grows in weight, obviously, if we eat too much, and naturally needs to be taken care of physically by means of exercise, medicine, so on and so forth, healthy diet, so on and so forth. In addition to that, we also believe, of course, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the human being an intellectual capacity, the ability to understand, the ability to perceive, the ability to rationalize, and so on and so forth. And in addition to that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also given the human being a spiritual component. The spiritual component of the human being being the utmost and the most important sort of dimension to the individual. وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْحَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has talked about the importance of caring and cultivating for the soul, or what we can often use interchangeably as the spirit. And I say all of this because when we talk about spiritual abuse, what we're also speaking to is the fact that the ability for that soul, for the human spirit, to cultivate itself and find a sense of closeness and find a sense of proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, anything that creates stagnation, anything that creates any barrier in terms of us allowing to develop our relationship with God within its various different dimensions, that can be a variation or a form of spiritual abuse. So again, to repeat, spiritual abuse, unlike other forms of abuse, is the abuse that an individual receives whereby they feel or whereby they are absolutely inflicted or have a roadblock that comes in their way, whereby it fails to allow for them to attain proximity or knowledge of God. And can, of course, come in various different dimensions, as we're going to be speaking about today. But particularly how it's often spoken about is the use of religion or religious terminology in creating those roadblocks for an individual to find and to perceive and to know their creator.
Thank you for that very succinct answer, Sister Berak. I would love to hear how you would define spiritual abuse in a psychotherapist context. You're muted.
Thank you so much, Sister Melanie. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. And thank you, Sheikhna, for that very explicit definition, looking at it from a spiritual religious perspective. So I'm going to be looking at it from both a psycho-spiritual perspective as well. So just like we described in terms of physical abuse, we know that the target is the physical body, right? And emotions are the target of emotional abuse. And the mind is for mental abuse. But when we look at what is the target of spiritual abuse, it becomes confusing, right? Is it merely the use of religion to harm others? So we're going to explore that in obviously so much more detail, because it is a complex topic and it's time that we speak about it openly. And also, like we mentioned earlier, in a sensitive manner. It can be very triggering, and please, for those who do get triggered, to please use the supports like we mentioned earlier. So when we look at it from the psychological perspective, in terms of the definition, it's still, as we say, a work in progress in terms of the formalized, widely definition. So there isn't something specific yet to that, right? So the word spiritual abuse, it has the same ambiguity as the words as spiritual and spirituality as we have in popular culture, which has led to many misunderstandings about the term and how and when to apply it correctly. So while spiritual abuse is not defined in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the ICD, which is the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems from the World Health Organization, there's no actual diagnosis. It conceptually falls within our understanding of coercive and abusive relationships. So it is unique in that the coercion abuse are derived from the misuse of perhaps, let's say, religious or spiritual frameworks, which then lead to the infliction of the psycho-spiritual harm that the Sheikh described earlier. So we can say, according to what we just said right now, the working definition is that have a look at spiritual abuse as a form of emotional and psychological abuse, and it is characterized by a systematic pattern of coercive and controlling behavior using religion.
Thank you both for those answers. It's very interesting to see how the two overlap and how they're each kind of considered a different form of abuse in each context. Shaykh Faiyaz, I'd like to ask you a quick question before we kind of segue into our next topic, our next point of discussion. So is spiritual abuse unique to Islam, and why does it often come up in this context, but maybe not as often in different world relations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that spiritual abuse is present within every single community, and every single religious tradition, because I think it's a social problem, right? So I wouldn't say that obviously spiritual abuse is Islamic, but certainly, without a doubt, there are those who abuse others in the name of religion. And I often like to say in a lot of public gatherings sort of in the community that if you see yourself, for instance, being abusive to anyone, or if you see yourself passing judgment, or if you see yourself sort of giving your feedback or opinions to others in a way that's restricting their potential growth, then you're doing it wrong, right? Of course, we have certain focal points and tenets within our religious tradition, that of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, commanding others toward goodness, inviting them toward goodness, and sort of repelling them away from evil. But even amongst sort of the ahadith of the Prophet and his family, peace and blessings be upon them, there's obviously this emphasis on making sure that one of the conditions of performing these two tenets of our faith is to recognize that the ones we are speaking to are actually going to be receptive to what it is that you're saying, right? So, unfortunately, it is a reality. It is present. To your latter question, or to part two or part B of your question, why isn't it something that we speak about? Well, I think there's obviously a lot of stigma around speaking, unfortunately, about a subject like this. And I think it's really, really beautiful that we have, at the very least, the opportunity to do so in a gathering like this, using the platform sort of that we've been afforded, and sort of the strides that we're trying to make in terms of eradicating a lot of the social diseases that we have within our communities. But these things, it's all about taking small incremental steps toward, first of all, bringing up the issue, and then finding the necessary resources toward combating those issues. And then hopefully, again, illuminating light in the midst of the darkness of any particular issue that we're enduring, that we're encountering. So undoubtedly, it is present, meaning that it is an unfortunate reality that we face, that individuals face within our communities. And number two, why is it that we're not speaking about it? Alhamdulillah, we have that opportunity. We're doing that right now. So hopefully we continue toward building upon conversations like this one. Again, hopefully at the service of victims of abuse and all of its various manifestations and dimensions.
Thank you, Shaykh Faiyaz. And I'm also happy that we have this platform today to speak about it. And now that we kind of have a working definition of spiritual abuse, looking from the religious perspective, one that kind of constricts the religious or spiritual potential of an individual, and from a psychotherapist perspective, a form of emotional and psychological abuse. Now I can kind of ask some more complicated questions. And this one I'm going to ask to Shaykh Faiyaz and then Sister Berak. How can we identify that spiritual abuse is occurring, and what are kind of the different forms and relationships, perhaps from a husband to a wife or from a teacher to a student and so on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it'd be great to also have Sister Berak answer a question similar to this one, from her lens and from her perspective. But really, really briefly, again, the way that we defined spiritual abuse early on in the conversation was the utilization of religion, spirituality, again, within its sort of, obviously the fact that it has many different dynamic definitions to them, but virtually the utilization of religion in order to restrict someone else's religion, so to say. And I realize that that's pretty complicated, but perhaps, with some examples, we can sort of, elucidate the point a little bit. There's many different realities whereby we see spiritual abuse and its manifestations in our communities today. And again, of course, I speak anecdotally, and I speak without sort of tangible evidences other than my own experiences in this regard. And I speak for myself only in this regard. In the work that I do as a chaplain at the university, I have individuals who come to me very often telling me that their relationship with God, their relationship with religion is so sort of distant. They don't feel any motivation to pray. They don't feel any motivation to fast. They feel very disconnected from God. They feel disconnected from the Quran, from the Prophet, so on and so forth. Oftentimes in engaging in conversation with them, digging down a little bit deeper, many a time it's their experiences that led them toward reaching certain conclusions which divorce them from their religious tradition, right? Why would someone dislike God? Why would someone not want to be in a state of servitude in communication with the Lord of the worlds, who is the most merciful of those who show mercy? Many a times it's because the way that they're taught God, the way that they're taught about God, the way that they're taught about the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon them, is through this lens of wrath, through this lens of negativity, through these negatively connotated terminologies. And that's really, really important for us to mention. That's not the God that I know. The God that I know is the one who introduces himself consistently as the most merciful of those who show mercy. We're taught from a very young age that, imagine Prophet Muhammad saw the way that you acted. Why are we taught like that? Why do we tell our kids that? If Prophet Muhammad saw the way that I acted, inappropriately by, doing something that I should not be doing, probably he'd pick me up and encourage me to get back on the right track, right? That's the way that we have to teach and know and understand about who the Prophet and his family, peace and blessings be upon them, are. And so again, without getting into so much detail, the various relationships that we often see, or that I personally often see in terms of spiritual abuse playing out, is many a time between spouses, between a husband and a wife, saying, if you do not do this, you are being disobedient to me, and being disobedient to me is disobedience to God. But using it in a manipulative way, sometimes it could potentially be legitimate, and on the flip side as well. Sometimes potentially is legitimate, but other times the utilization of a language like that is in order to manipulate one's spouse or one's child. A mother or father telling their children, that you are not allowed to marry this person without any sort of good justification. And if you marry this person, you are being disobedient to me, and disobedience to me is disobedience to the Prophet, and disobedience is you're committing a sin, and you are going to be casted away into the divine inferno of the fires of hell. right? This sort of language and this sort of rhetoric we hear, unfortunately, all too often. It could also be, again, between a teacher and a student. It could be, again, within a whole host of various different dimensions, within the religious leader of the community, with members of their community, but utilizing religion in order to manipulate others, which by cause restricts their ability to find God, toward knowing God, to fulfilling their religious/spiritual responsibilities, is probably how we can see many a time spiritual abuse play out. My apologies, sisters, for the long answer.
Thank you. And don't say sorry. What you said is so important, especially I feel like for youth today, especially, and even those who may not be like in those marital relationships, but like you said, it happens in so many different dimensions, and it's important to be aware of those red flags. And Sister Berak, I would love to hear your answer to his question as well.
I was mesmerized with how the Sheikh was describing things on point with a lot of things that I also see, whether it's in the student body, young people, or in the community. And a lot of people reach out describing scenarios that they've been involved with where they label it as spiritual abuse or some kind of abuse, but may not have a title or a name to it. And it does lie exactly with what we've heard so far in terms of the parental position and how they use religion towards the child. There's also between partners, like we were saying, and that's classic. You hear that from usually the husbands who are saying, you have to obey me, you can't leave the house, if you this and that, then you're against that whole domino effect, right? That you are angering God, basically. We see that with teachers. We see that with any person in a position of authoritative power. So we can define that to any of the titles that we've seen so far. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail in terms of how it can be identified, right? And we see this position of power like we described in any profession. I think right away people, when they hear spiritual abuse, right away they label and tag it, oh, this is a religious leader. But no, and this is why we're doing this program, is to explore it further, to understand that it's not the stereotypical misconception that we have when you hear that. It is about people in different professions as well, including, yes, like the Sheikh mentioned, religious as well. So how does this look like? It can be identified through seeing manipulation and exploitation, enforced accountability. You see censorship of decision making. So the person doesn't have the independence of deciding on their own. It's forced on them, whether it's by a teacher, a parent, a partner, or a person in position of power in the community. It requirements of secrecy and silence. So doing things and telling the person not to say anything about it, right? To keep it silent. We see that with partners when let's say one partner forces the other person to isolate them from the community, isolate them from family and friends because they're abusing them in some form or another, right? So we see this also in terms of coercion to conform. So the inability to ask questions, which is ironic, I find, given that in our own faith, we are encouraged to ask questions, right? So control through the use of our sacred texts and our holy books and the teachings and the hadith, right? Like the Sheikh mentioned earlier. So requirement of this type of obedience to the person who is causing this abuse. So suggestion that the abuser, they have some kind of divine position, right? So you hear that commonly, I find, and I'm speaking specifically here that I see from, let's say, the Arabic or Muslim community, where the father would say, I am the God of the house, ana rabbil bayt, right? So they put themselves in that position, and you must listen to me and you must follow what I say. I know best. Meanwhile, they're using religion in a wrong fashion to get what they want and manipulating others, right? So this is just one example. You have, like we mentioned, isolation as a means of punishment and disconnecting the person from getting the support and resources that they need. There's superiority, right? And elitism. We've seen that as well. And I think as we're describing this, and that's why we said, please be aware that some of this could be triggering. We see this often, right? We've all come across this in some form or another, and sometimes not even being aware that some of these are they are abuse, right? And of course, shame. Forcing somebody to feel shame. And we see that, I think, in calling out people, let's say if they're not dressed a certain way, of modesty or hijab, perhaps, right? So causing shame and that can also be seen according to our working definition of using spiritual abuse, right? So there's so many different factors and layers, and inshallah, we're slowly by the end of our session today uncover a lot of it, inshallah.
Thank you, Sister Berak. And I kind of have a bit of a follow-up question to that. And kind of like how we discussed in our previous webinars, how mental health sometimes is not considered an actual, it's not something that's physical, and some people, for that reason, they kind of diminish it. So in the same way, people often, they don't recognize that spiritual abuse is actually abuse, as it's physically evident, as it's not evident like physical abuse. But why do you think it's important for our communities to understand its impact? Why are we even having this discussion?
So exactly like you said, Sister Melanie, because there are a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings and stereotypes around mental health and taboo and shame, right? Then this is probably just pushed in with the rest of mental health issues because you cannot see it, right? So it is really important to understand the impact of, first of all, mental illnesses, mental disorders, and mental conditions, and how they impact you, somebody who has been, let's say, spiritually abused, right? So the impact could be long-term. It could be something that may not show up for years later, right? Some people could show signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Something could happen later on that could trigger them into remembering something that happened to them. Or let's say they are no longer in this situation. Let's say they were in an abusive marriage where there was a lot of spiritual abuse used against them. Let's say they encounter something that reminds them of that person, or something that person said from a religious text of some sort that could re-trigger them, right? So I've seen also, and it's commonly known, that perhaps that person who was spiritually abused would blame an organization where there was somebody in a position of power and on the board member or whatever that misused their power into a lot of what we describe: manipulation, coercion, et cetera, that could also impact that person, right? So it could be the parent, like we said, community, right? And what happens is this person potentially could leave this community, right? And explicitly, let's say it this way, they could leave that faith because of that one bad apple, so to speak, that caused the damage of that personal and spiritual growth of that person, of that individual, right? This person could ask questions in terms of how it impacts them, right? In terms of the sense of trust of the world around them, especially when we talk about it from a psychological perspective. A child and their parent, there's that bonding, right? And there's that attachment, what kind of attachment and development that they are going through as a child, right? So when a child cries and the mother or the father runs to the child to see what their needs are, there's a building of trust between the child and the parent and the world around them. So it's a simple example of a child and the attachment and the trust in the world, right? And if we apply that same concept here to, let's say, a lot of the figures that we've mentioned already, a parent, a teacher, the person in a position of authority in the community or wherever, that sense of trust could be damaged and broken, right? And questions come out such as, who can I trust? Who am I? You know, how do I cope with this fear of people finding out, or people will believe me or not, right? What do I believe now? This person represented something to me, and there was a break of trust there. You know, how long is this going to impact me? How long is this going to last? Who is here to support me? Who's going to believe me? So all sorts of questions around the damage inflicted could trigger these types of questions to the person. And I've seen this. I've seen where, unfortunately, people have left the faith or have taken off, you know, the articles of modesty, or speak in a way that is not positive against the system or people or their family or certain people, because that this person has caused them this damage to their own spirituality of growth, like the way we've been describing so far. So again, there's a lot around that, and it is important that we understand there is an impact. We've seen that, and it's huge when it comes to that loss of trust and faith, especially when we're talking about key figures in a person's life that they rely on for that trust and growth, and just that trust in the world, because they represent so much to them that they've hurt them that way that they cannot trust the same way as before. So these are some of the implications and the impact that could occur from spiritual abuse. And of course, without saying and understanding, all forms of abuse.
Thank you, Sister Barak. I think that was a very relevant answer for everyone listening. And I hope our audience is taking notes on trusting those who are close to us. And Sheikh Faiyaz, I do have a similar question for you. So in the context of dealing with Islamophobia, and because our community, we want to put our best face forward, everyone is always watching us, do you find that it's sometimes harder to explore and talk about these very real issues?
No, I don't feel that's the case, because I believe that we have a responsibility internally before we have a responsibility externally. I believe that it's important for us to be real, right? To just be quite frank, that we need to make sure that we are creating avenues, entry points, access points for every member of our community to find a place whereby they can get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Otherwise, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of all of this? You know, as in my role, sort of in my faith leader or my faith servant role, I think it's really, really important to making sure that every individual is able to find God, is able to have the same equal access toward knowing Him and toward learning about Him. And if we create restrictions or decide not to speak about certain things because of stigmas or because of cultural obstacles or hurdles, then the only thing that we're doing, like Sister Barak had mentioned, is that we're creating another roadblock or creating detriment whereby we may potentially be responsible for someone virtually walking outside of the mosque, the Islamic center, or just completely neglecting religion entirely because of an experience. Again, whether it's justified or not, we should still feel a brunt of responsibility if someone came to me, spoke with me, or spoke with anyone, or just experienced something poor, at home and did not have the opportunity to share that and have their experience validated at the very least. We have responsibilities to members of our community, right? I think that goes, firstly and foremostly. Even sort of in Islamic law, if there is charity due to someone in your family, meaning someone cannot afford to pay their monthly or yearly expenses, for instance, it's an obligation for me to give my charity to them before sending it overseas. Even when it comes toward, obligatory zakat, for instance, be it zakat al-fitr or otherwise, I have to give it within my locale, right? For instance, I live in New York City, I have to give it to people in New York City before sending it to India or to Pakistan or to Iraq or to anywhere else in the world, or even sending it to Canada, right? Because I have responsibilities to those within my community, firstly and foremostly. And I would say the same. I understand that speaking about these issues or speaking about the reality of certain obstacles and hurdles that we may encounter within our communities may give Islam a bad name, but that's, unfortunately, the Islamophobia funded train is going to do anything and everything in order to create problems and in order to demonstrate that we have issues, right? But again, that's a communal issue. There's nothing wrong with Islam. Islam in itself is beautiful, and Islam itself is perfect, and Islam in itself is manifested by the light of the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa alihi wasallam and his family. And if you find something wrong with them, well, then bring it to us, and we guarantee you that it's going to be, first of all, very difficult, no matter how you dig and no matter how far deep you run, in order to find something on the holy progeny. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that no, I don't think that it's a problem, and I think that, again, the fact that we have the opportunity to, at the very least, bring light toward a dark issue, that's a good step in the right direction. And what it does is it really strengthens our community when you can combat some of the social ills that we find, speak to them again, and find solutions to them. What we're doing is making progress, right? Anyone and everyone seeks perfection during the course of our lives. We want to get better at what it is that we do. And we want to sort of work toward this slow, incremental, progression during the course of our lives. And naturally, we want to make sure that those who are listening today, or our communities more broadly in the United States or North America or all across the world, we're strengthening ourselves so that we're able to illuminate those values of perfection ideally. And it starts again by speaking about issues that sometimes may be difficult to communicate about.
Thank you, Shaykh Faiyaz. It's very refreshing to hear. And it's always a great reminder that part of our responsibility is to speak out against these injustices. And so now that we've kind of done the background work, now I kind of wanted to get into the very much like, what do you do if this is happening? So first I'm going to gear this to Shaykh Faiyaz and then to Berak. So what should we do about situations of potential abuse from all of these different situations that we've been discussing, from any representative or any professional, be it a family member or a teacher or others who are inflicting spiritual abuse on another person?
Was that for me? I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Yes.
You chopped up a little bit, internet.
Okay. What should we
Might
do
have been on
about
my side.
situations of potential abuse from any representative or any kind of relationship that we talked about on another person who are inflicting spiritual abuse?
Yeah. You know, and I agree with you that these are going to be a little bit of the more heavier and sensitive questions, right? Because we can speak about, you know, sort of the bird's eye view of things very, very easily and very charismatically and very eloquently. But when it comes toward real experiences and anecdotes, that's where things become obviously a little bit more challenging, and they become that much more meaningful, especially to those who may have had experiences, you know, like those that you have mentioned. You know, unfortunately, again, these are realities that we often see. I would say that, you know, would have to go, or that individual would have to go through multiple steps. Step number one would be, again, go back toward finding the strength within their faith, because I think a lot of people, it's very easy for them to, you know, see faith as the cause or the deficiency that led them to being in the struggle. And I know saying that is very easy for me to say, sitting on this side of the screen, so to say. But it's just that much more important for us to go back toward the strength or the resilience that our faith teaches us, and go back toward those convictions, remembering that God is there, and God has commanded us also to go and look and to find resources available that we can communicate with. And I say this because a lot of times, many individuals who encounter abuse in any one of its various dimensions, be it spiritual, be it financial, be it physical, be it, you know, sexual, be it whatever it may be, are told to be patient. They're told to be patient the way Zainab was patient. Do you know what happened to Imam al-Hussain? Do you know what happened to the daughters of Imam Hussain? And they're taught to relegate their emotions and channel them through individuals from the 6th and 7th centuries. And while I agree that that might be a form of strength for some, speaking to someone who is a victim of abuse in that way is manipulative in and of itself. It's awfully and incredibly problematic to do so. I recognize that what I say may not be so popular, but it's really, really important for me to make mention of.
Absolutely. I second what you're saying, Sheikhna. I mean, they are used as a source of inspiration, but we cannot use them as a tool to, in a way, invalidate the experience of somebody going through experiences in this century, for example.
Exactly.
We use them as a source of strength and inspiration, but when we do that, I find that this is invalidating their experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I would say that the second step that one should take then is, again, going and finding resources that you can communicate with in order to remove yourself from a situation that may lead toward even further detriment. Spiritual abuse, many a time, not always, many a time can be a gateway toward physical abuse, can be a gateway toward sexual abuse, can be a gateway toward all of the other forms of abuse that we can speak about perhaps on another conversation, or maybe it's already been spoken about. Sister Berak is obviously a wonderful resource, you know, in regards to a lot of these matters. So I would say that finding those resources, and again, identifying the problem, and then seeking resources locally within your communities. There's no harm in going to see a therapist. There's no harm in going to see a counselor. When you're physically ill, you go to a doctor. When you're spiritually ill, when you're mentally ill, when you're going through hardship, when you're seeing roadblocks sort of occur on your way, find the resources that can be helpful. Make the complaints that need to be communicate issues, write them down if you can't verbally communicate them. Do what you can toward preserving yourself, because again, there's potential for, unfortunately, further risk down the road.
Absolutely. And in addition to what you were saying earlier, Sheikhna, there was such a huge stigma and taboo and shame in our communities when it came to talking about mental health. But we see, alhamdulillah, in the last 5 years, there's been a change in the shift in that, because a lot of groups such as I.M.A.M are diving into it and exploring it and making the connection to the Islamic perspective and how vital it is for us to have that growth from all aspects of our lives, just like it was taught to us by Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salam, with this hadith that I use again and again because I find it beautifully reiterates finding that balance amongst all aspects of our lives by spending time, with our family, with work, to ourselves, and with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So that right there is all about wellness. And so when we see that shift in the last few years towards openly talking about things that we felt embarrassed about, shy about, unsure how to even approach it, because people thinking that we are crazy because we're talking about anxiety, fears, and depressions, and so on and so forth, or even suicidality or domestic abuse. Well, now I think, we're getting comfortable by approaching such topics as this one, right? Being able to talk about it in an open manner, understanding what it's about, and looking about what do we do about such a situation, right? And so as a professional in my field, if there are any situations like that, just like a doctor would, a lawyer, psychotherapist, we go to a representative of that profession to put in the complaint, just like the Sheikh was saying. So if anybody comes across any kind of abuse, whether it be physical, domestic, spiritual, sexual, to learn who you can go to talk to about this, right? A representative, any profession, including, like the chef said, within our own communities, to talk to a trusted person about what happened, to get the supports that you need to work through it. I'll give a quick example. I recently experienced a racist experience when I was in the hospital because of COVID. And it infuriated me that in this day and age, we're still experiencing this, but we're seeing it coming out more openly and vividly with people now. And I went to a representative in the department in the hospital after I went to the physicians and surgeons of Ontario, the college, and said, hey, this happened, I want to put in a complaint. And so I was directed to the hospital, and I dealt with it. I spoke with the professional team there, and they took it into stride and they dealt with it accordingly. So this is the type of advice we would give, is to go to a representative of whatever part of the community, profession, and talk to the people about what happened. Follow up with them. Don't let it go. That's another thing, is because sometimes you feel, well, who's going to listen to me? What's the point of this? Oh, it's going to drag on. I was told right from the beginning, this could take a while. This is where be patient was useful, right? To understand the red tape, the bureaucracy sometimes. However, if you follow up with it consistently, know what your rights are, and we'll get into that in just a moment, but this is really important for people to understand these things ahead of time, or rather, even as they happen, if you are not aware or you haven't been in such a situation, or somebody comes to you and says, hey, this is what happened to me, then these are the steps that the Sheikh and I have explained to you, inshallah.
If I could just, if you don't mind, I could just add to that point, or really to the question that you had asked Sister Melanie, at the beginning, which is that having conversations like the one that we're having are also meant for our communities to kind of step up, or individuals really within the communities, or make a collective effort, for us to be proactive prior to, the potential for abuse being manifest within a household, within a community, within, a respective family or whatnot. To making sure that we're aware again of our rights, as Sister Berak mentioned. We'll hopefully get into that in a little while. And it goes sort of as simple as recognizing what is haram, right, and what is not, what is permissible and what is impermissible, to making sure that we are advocating, particularly for women in our communities prior to marriage. Of course, the Imam Mahdi Association of Marja'iyya has a really wonderful template, of a marriage contract, which offers and affords both parties, but particularly the woman, a whole host of unique rights leading up to the day of their marriage, in order to again offer them the necessary protections from all of the various forms of abuse that we have consistently seen over decades and decades in order to, again, mitigate any serious potential for, abuse moving forward. Again, having conversations like this, raising good children, providing sort of value-based equitable systems, within our mosques, within our communities, within our Islamic centers, educational programs like this one, or that which is founded sort of on I.M.A.M's website by means of articles and so on and so forth, in order, again, to create this really wholesome environment whereby we're going back toward these really important, sublime metaphysical themes, toward recognizing that our religious-based system is valued on mercy, is valued on compassion, is valued on justice. That's the quickest and best way toward mitigating a lot of the hardships that we unfortunately see. In the same way that you take a look, in the corporate world, where unfortunate realities, like Sister Berak mentioned, of racisms and discriminations and bigotries are consistently present. The way that you start toward eradicating problems like that, in addition to hopefully catering toward those victims, is to initiate sort of very progressive movements like that of D&I initiatives, diversity and inclusivity, equitability, and so on and so forth, to making sure that you have a firm commitment toward the values that that particular corporation, or in this particular sort of example, that our communities, that our tradition, that our mosques, are all speaking to, right? And it goes back toward the teachings and the light is sort of perpetrated as emanated by the Prophet and his family. Peace and blessings be upon them.
And just to add a little to that, this is all the theory. This is all what we believe, right? In reality, this is not what people do. They don't follow like that. And I mean, the example of the parent, let's say, or the father, and or it could be a mother, not just necessarily the father or the husband, right? Is that they could be preaching something publicly in the community of something against, and I've seen this, whether it be, talking about women's rights. Meanwhile, at home, they're not giving their wives the rights, right? Talking about how to treat children well, but at home, they're not treating their children well. Using religion as say, this is what our religion teaches us. This is what you're supposed to do with your families, but at home, they're doing the opposite. So there is theory, and then there's practice, and then there's hypocrisy as well, that people are not necessarily following. And what our religion, our beautiful religion, teaches us. And this again comes down to that same idea of there's Islam and then there's Muslims. There's the perfection of the religion and how we're supposed to practice it. And then there are those who try to practice it or use the religion for their own benefits and means. Meanwhile, they are desecrating or completely disrespecting what their religion is all about. Hence, you have that domino effect in the community, or children, or people of other faiths when they look upon you, right? So it's really important that as much as we can say of how beautiful our religion is, there's also the ugly side of people that we see in our work. And Sheikhna, I know you can attest to that with the people that come to you with their stories. For me, it is daily because it is my work. But when I come across these situations, it's really sad because we believe in our faith. We love what our religion teaches us, the examples, the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhum as-salam, yet you see the hypocrisy of people using that. It's quite disturbing, actually. It leaves a bad taste, and we are seasoned professionals, you could say. So I can only imagine somebody who is, let's say, new to religion or new learning, or let's say not really into it the way we are because of our work. They can be completely turned off and impacted in such negative ways that we've described already.
Thank you both for those very practical steps. And this actually segues into my next question. Hopefully we can touch upon this more. What are some of the ways Muslim communities can raise awareness about spiritual abuse? And what can a community do together to kind of protect and prevent these spiritual abuses from happening? Shaykh Faiyaz, I can ask you this one first.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I probably answered this question sort of in my previous rant. You get a little bit charged up, obviously, with issues like this one. Again, preventative measures like educational programming, preventative measures like sort of value-based teaching. What do I mean by value-based teaching for just one moment? Maybe that will be helpful. We go to, we send our kids, for instance, to Saturday or Sunday schools, and it's really, really important at the same time for parents to also continue their education as well. And I recognize that that's really, really difficult. But if, we create systems whereby to incentivize, parents even to sit in gatherings, or whereby hopefully, I don't know, potentially religious leaders can mandate, prior toward the performing of a nikah, an aqdun nikah, marriage, an Islamic marriage, that they mandate the couple to sit down, with the officiant, for instance, whereby they can go over sort of, a marriage contract or discuss some sort of premarital counseling, to breaking down the stigmas around talking to others, right, about issues like these. Programs like this one, whereby we're just, again, shedding a little bit of a glimpse into the reality of a lot of the hurdles that many individuals unfortunately have to deal with, on a day-to-day basis. These are all really small steps that we can take. But I think as an individual, what we can do is we can sort of sit back for just a moment, after this particular program, or whenever we have a moment, and really think about whether or not we are seeking equity, whether or not we are truly seeking toward being an individual who is compassionate. I.M.A.M. bu'ithtu li'utammim makarim al-akhlaq. At the end of the day, the principle that the messenger of God was sent upon was to perfect the qualities and the character of his community. It doesn't go without saying that all of the matters of law and jurisprudence, which of course is super important within our religious tradition, goes back toward cultivating a spiritual nature of that individual, like we talked about before. Law, the obligations of prayers and fasting, and Hajj and Zakat and Khums, and all of the other things that we have within our religious tradition, they're all meant toward cultivating a spiritual. I say this fairly often for those who hear me speak often. Ritual is meant toward cultivating spiritual. Spiritual means to know God. Okay, within the definition, hopefully, that we're working with, again, recognizing sort of the dynamic nature of the term. It means toward making sure that we are the best individual that we have the capacity and potential to be. That means being good to your neighbors. That means being kind to your spouse and toward your children. That means that you are a mercy to those around you. Individuals, they love to be around you, right? It's not so complex. It doesn't need, equations or difficult terminologies for us to deduce the fact that being a good person is really, really important. And if we are truly seeking toward being a good person every single day, and a better person than we were yesterday, I speak to myself before anyone else, if we are truly seeking that on an individual level, then hopefully, again, we can start to illuminate this light and truly be the preventative measure and the support that so many of those within our communities need.
Thank you, Shaykh Faiyaz. And Sister Berak, I would ask you the same question, and I would kind of rephrase it towards you. How do we talk about spiritual abuse in our communities? And is it a community issue, or is it rather an issue of our culture or national traditions that empowers this kind of our one group to abuse another by using religion as a pretext?
I believe it's an individual issue, meaning that a person could potentially, and I'm getting deep into psychology analysis here, but could be somebody who has a narcissistic type of behavior, who's very arrogant and has a superior already attitude towards others, who just happens to be, let's say, in a position of power, right? And meaning position of power, like we said, a parent, a teacher, it could be, at a center, it could be a doctor, a lawyer, a scholar, a sheikh, whomever you want to label in a position of authority and power, right? Who just happens to have this personality and believes that others are below them, right? And so see how individual it is. So it's not necessarily a whole culture, a whole community, or a religion, or a group. I don't believe that. However, these same individuals could, let's say, be a group of people sharing the same beliefs and personality types, where they could collectively bully other people, coerce other people. You see that dynamic in cults, right? You see that in cults where they coerce people through fear. If you don't do this, you will be kicked out, or worse. So I don't believe it's something that we can just you know, as the expression goes, paint everybody with the same brush. No, we see this in all faiths. We see this in all cultures. Yet I do believe it is at the individual level. However, they are using their religion, they're using their culture, they're using the group dynamic to coerce, bully, and if spiritually or physically, mentally, whatever, any fill in the blank abuse that they do, right? So that's the first part. The second part is in terms of how do we work on solutions, right? Like, how do we bring this up in our community? What can we do in terms of preventing this, and so on and so forth? So I'll speak specifically from my aspect in terms of my line of work, and it has to do with speaking out on behalf of my clients, whether it's clients in my office or people that come to me to consult, to talk to me about their problems from the community, outside the community, but reach out for advice and support, right? These are people who are afraid of speaking up about this topic, let's say, right? Who may be silenced or vilified for being honest about their experiences, right? So just like the Sheikh said, having this medium to talk about this and this platform to acknowledge, right, and validate and do this preventative work of education, this is how we can begin helping, right? Because this has been swept under the rug far too long. Just like we have when we talk about mental health issues, when we talk about domestic violence, these issues are so sensitive. They have damaged people for life. And if we don't do the preventative work right now and be proactive, we're going to lose a whole community of people, a whole generation of people. It's simple as that, right? So it's really important that we create open spaces, secure spaces for people validating their experience. And this is the number one thing we do in our work as therapists, is we validate the experience. We normalize the pain, right? To a very uncommon or not normal behavior, right? And the abnormal behavior that comes out of this not normal situation, if that makes sense, right? When you validate someone's pain like that and you work through it with them and processing it and empowering them, taking them from victim to survivor to empowering them, that's how we do that work. And it's a whole process, right? It's a whole process, and it depends on the individual. It depends on their strengths, their abilities, if they are ready to deal with this or not as well, right? And so it could be a short-term thing in terms of the person working through, and it could take a long time given the damage, right? And so a lot of the work I do, like I said, with university students, especially those, and I've had many students, by the way, of different faiths, not necessarily Islamic faith, who have been spiritually abused as well, who have been sexually abused, physically abused, emotionally abused, all under the guise of religion. So we do see it in other faiths, like the Sheikh was saying, and we see how it can really hurt people. And so sometimes people are not even aware, like we said, that they are being abused spiritually in the context of our discussion. So having the education about it can really help later on in terms of if recognizing that you are being manipulated, that you are being coerced, whether it is in a marriage with somebody who's using their rights over your rights, like the Sheikh was talking about, having that contract done ahead of time to protect the woman, the man as well. It goes both ways. We've seen damage done to both genders, right? So it's really important to have that education, that open space, that awareness, and in our communities for the people who are in positions of power, to create that safe space, you know what, and say, it's okay to talk about this. You can come to us for support. We are here to support you. We validate your experience and not be dismissive, because that's the number one thing that a lot of people, perhaps who don't understand the type of abuse that's going on, what they would do is they would dismiss it. Why do you think a lot of women who get sexually harassed and attacked, or raped, in other words, don't go to the police? Because they're not going to be, they don't believe that they will be believed. They're going to be interrogated. And that puts a lot of shame, that puts a lot of pressure on that person, especially something so private and it was out of their control. So it's really important to empower and give that safe space for the person to feel safe to share this. And I have stories upon stories upon stories, which I'm sure the Sheikh can also tell you that he has heard as well. And confidentiality, because that is another issue within the context of mental health. I think in all diverse communities, when it comes to stigma and not getting help and support, because there is that fear of their privacy being put out there in the whole community. And this would be one of them when we're talking about spiritual abuse, because it's such a delicate topic. And when we look at it from the classic idea of the initial thought that comes into our head when we see the word spiritual abuse or hear it, that it would be somebody who is in a position of a religious power that would hurt other people outside of marriage, within marriage, et cetera, et cetera. So again, to summarize, education, the validation, creating the safe spaces, and this goes from the home, from our parents learning, parenting skills and so on and so forth, understanding the religion in a proper way, not in a culturally way, just like Imam Ali alayhi salam. And I love this description of how he describes, and I'm paraphrasing, is to raise your children, not in the time that you grew up, but in your time, right? And that's ultimate psychology, developmental psychology right there, is to understand how to raise your children through faith, not necessarily through culture, because there's a lot of great things to culture, but there are things that contradict the faith, which is my point here. And again, when it comes to other people in positions of power, whether it's teacher or professions and so on and so forth.
Thank you both for those very deep reflections. And I think, like you both mentioned, that solutions to spiritual abuse and what to do in situations is the most important. I also wanted to segue and give some time to our audience members for anyone who has questions. We do have a very interesting one here. I'll read it out to you, and whoever feels like they can best answer can take a stab at it. Being that spiritual abuse isn't just from a religious perspective, would you say that behaviors such as gaslighting, guilt tripping, rejection, and deflection, which are commonly used in mental, emotional, and verbal abuse, are also forms of spiritual abuse, highlighting the relationship between the mind/intellect, heart, and soul?
Absolutely, 100% agree. They've nailed it right on the spot there. And then you see these characteristics used: the gaslighting, projection, and guilt tripping. That's classic in any abusive relationship, whether it's a friendship, by the way, whether it's a relationship, right? Whether it's all the other relationships that we've described today. These are classic symptoms and behaviors of abuse. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Just one more thing before the Sheikh jumps in here. I also wanted to mention that it's important to call it out. From the last question, what are the things that we can do? We need to call it out as it is as well. Just like we say we need to call out racism, just like we need to call out discriminatory behavior. But there are tactics and ways of doing this delicately, because if, let's say, you call out a religious leader, right? The media can have, oh, they're going to love that, right? So we have to be very careful. We've seen that also in other faiths, how that's been taken advantage of. So there are delicate ways and steps of speaking privately about this to address the issue, because what happens is then you're conflating the person and the religion, and then that causes damage across the board. And then what happens is the victim here is not getting their justice. So when we do call it out, we need to call it out in a way that is delicate, but it's addressing the issue, just like we mentioned earlier, knowing where to go to and who to go to, but making sure that you continue with that, because it can really come back and harm you in a very, very impactful, terrible way later on.
Yeah, maybe just to quickly elaborate on that point, which you mentioned so eloquently, sister, is, we live like in this, cancel culture, whereby it's really, really easy to kind of vocalize certain things. But oftentimes what it does is it leads to the detriment of the actual victim, right? Many a time. And at the end of the day, the care and concern that we should be showing is for someone who has been victimized by that form of abuse, whatever sort of dimension that it is, but potentially in this regard, spiritual abuse. And the steps that need to be taken, like Sister Berak had mentioned earlier, is that someone who is now a victim of the abuse, we need to help them. They are the primary concern. What are the steps that we are taking in order to protect them, firstly and foremostly, from any sort of potential physical or sexual abuse, that has the ability to potentially stem from the initial spiritual abuse, But then slowly, again, of course, from the lens that I'm looking at, in order to also repair the relationship with faith, right? In order to repair the relationship with God, in order to repair the relationship with themselves, right? At the end of the day, we need to be understanding of the nuance and the delicate nature of what it is that every individual sort of is experiencing. And I would say this, right? Just as a quick point, I know it's, I guess, obvious that every individual's experience is unique to them, right? Everyone has a lot of nuance to them. I teach a couple of courses as a professor at New York University. And one of the assignments that I started to do is to let students in the very first days of class talk a little bit about themselves, right? Or define themselves by 5 terms, for instance. And what you'll find is that by giving individuals an opportunity to share a little bit about themselves, we realize that there's so much depth and so much nuance to every single one of us, right? Even though you might be spending time with someone for 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, when you let them explain or talk about themselves, talk about their experiences and the way that they understood things, you recognize that there's so much more detail and depth to that. And I would say that we can't paint the same brush for every victim as well of spiritual abuse, right? Meaning that everyone needs to be cared for and concerned for delicately, recognizing the nuance, recognizing, again, those dynamic relationships that we spoke about, parent to a child, even child to a parent, right? Many a time I see it, unfortunately, more often than I'd like. Husband to a wife, wife to a husband, teacher to a student, religious leader to a member of their congregation, whatever it may be. It's important, again, that at the end of the day, what are we doing toward offering help to the one who needs that given moment, taking them from step A towards Z, so they're able to, again, know themselves, improve their relationship with themselves, and of course, eventually lead them toward an understanding of, once again, who God is, who the Prophet is, what the Quran is, so on and so forth.
Sheikhna, you brought up a really important point, the cancel culture that we're in these days, right? It's quite powerful, and we've seen it from celebrities to, whether it's in our community or outside of our community, it's really powerful. And there's a time to use it and a time not to use it, absolutely, right? I had a thought and it just slipped my mind. Oh yes, so then there's the opposite of that, in the sense that not everything that happens is abuse as well. All right, because then we've seen the range of it where there are these traumatic incidences, and then there's people who, let's just say it truthfully, and they got to toughen up a little bit with the challenges of the world out there, right? And I say that with compassion and love, not like, hey, toughen up, just like that, but to also understand not every single thing that happens out there is abuse, because then we're just pointing fingers everywhere and it just becomes a mess, because then we're not understanding what it truly is. This is in no way invalidating difficult experiences that people go through, but it's also a chance to reflect upon these challenges that happen around you. Are they truly this, or are they not that? This is not to second guess, but to look at it from a critical perspective. Is this worth pursuing as well? Is it truly the definition of what this is? Because sometimes we conflate, sometimes we mix, sometimes we don't understand. Sometimes people deliberately go out there and try to ruin people as well, right? We don't know what their intentions are, but I'm just speaking of, again, what I've seen out there, right? So there's, yes, we need to understand what it is so we can call it out and get the support. And then sometimes people take everything against them, and anything that anybody says at them, even looking at them the wrong way, they could consider that as a form of bullying or abuse and so on and so forth. And maybe this person has experienced so much trauma that they would interpret that. But I'm also just putting that as a thought out there as well, to be critical in terms of what we experience, to understand what it truly is before we start getting into the cancel culture and so on and so forth, because that's also very damaging, because then you could potentially be accusing somebody of something that is not true. That's also something to consider.
Thank you both. And I do have one last question from the audience before we transition to wrapping up our program tonight. And this is also a follow-up to our last question we were discussing. Can another way to look at spiritual abuse from an Islamic perspective be the deliberate or premeditated attack of the aql by the abuser?
I can take this one. I would say that, first of all, I think it's important to then, define what is the aql. Right? When we go back toward, the traditions of the Prophet and his family, peace and blessings be upon them. First of all, the aql is often translated as the intellect, right? The ability to know or the ability to perceive. That's many times the way that the aql or the intellect is defined, sort of Platonic or Aristotelian, in terms of some Western logic and so on and so forth. In reality, what the aql is, as taught to us by the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, is the ability to know and perceive and be receptive toward the teachings of divine revelation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the intellect. And on the flip side, he has given us the Quran and the words of the Prophet and his family. The ability that we have to intrinsically, innately, the gift that he has given us to know that there is truth in the signs that surround us, the sun and the moon and the stars, and allow for it to take us closer toward God, all of that comes from the gift known as the aql. Because again, it leads us toward a deep knowledge. And you could take a look at the example of a child. A child at a very young age, even before it's able to speak, loves to be outdoors, loves to look at the sun. I know my, younger daughter, whose birthday is today, she loves to look at the moon till this very day. She'll stare at it, and from the very young age, because why? Because there's something innate within her that allows for her to see the uniqueness of that sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I would say that, again, I don't know, of course, specifics of the example that the questioner was sort of speaking to, but I would say that if there is a roadblock whereby an individual creates that hinders someone else from truly being receptive to that truth, through a covering, through a veiling, through a manipulation that does not allow for them to learn toward knowing God, his Prophet, the Quran, the words of Ahlul Bayt, or even things as simple as something, for instance, that I've seen, a just for lack of a better example, or one that were spoken about earlier, a husband not necessarily sharing the rights of the wife to his spouse in order to manipulate her or in order to abuse her, right? That in itself can be certainly a manifestation of spiritual abuse, right? I'm not going to give you access toward, local resources that can sort of help you know your rights as a wife, for instance, right? Or the restriction of parents to their child saying that, anyone that I do not allow for you to marry, because I am the boss of the house and I make the rules, and anything that you do to disobey me, and if you end up marrying this man, for instance, you are committing a sin, whatever it might be, utilizing that without them having access to the actual truth and knowledge and teachings within our law, within our jurisprudence, within the teachings of the Prophet and family, that can all be sort of a manifestation of spiritual abuse within this definition that we spoke about, earlier. But again, I would say that I'm speaking again sort of very ambiguously, because again, every issue and every circumstance has its own nuance to it. And I wasn't exactly sure, of course, from the question, the detail surrounding the particular episode that individual may be encountering or dealing with it at the moment. Hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that was clear.
Thank you, Shaykh Faiyaz. And we did have a few requests for the two of you to share your contact information. So when you get a chance, that would be very helpful. And I would also like to ask in the next few minutes, any kind of sort of to wrap up our conversation, any hopeful takeaways you may have, any reminders or encouragement for spiritual or dealing with spiritual abuse, anything you guys would like to leave us with on a final note.
Sister, should I begin or should?
I was going to say, please go ahead, Sheikhna.
Yes. Thank you, Sister Melanie, for giving this opportunity. I would say that I recognize, of course, that the topic in itself is difficult and it's challenging. And it's also hard to really pinpoint specific issues because, again, every case and every circumstance has its own nuance and detail and depth to it. That said, I'm really hopeful at the same time in the midst of a lot of the doom and gloom, so to say. I'm very hopeful that by starting this conversation, that by creating the opportunity to speak about, again, challenges such as this one, that hopefully collectively we can be a resource for you all or any individual who may be encountering obstacles and hurdles during the course of their lives. There is a lot of darkness in the world, but through our individual and through our collective processes, we hope to, inshallah, illuminate some light. And really, truly, from the bottom of my heart and with all sincerity, if I can be helpful in my personal capacity with anyone or with everyone who's encountering any sort of hardship, I'd be more than happy to be of assistance to the best of my capacity. But at the same time, don't feel embarrassed, don't feel shy to reach out to local resources, to go and seek the necessary help, to finding the therapists and the counselors when you are undergoing certain hardships. And inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it easy for you. And may Allah bless you all. Please forgive me for any shortcomings.
Thank you so much, Sheikhna. It's been an honor and pleasure sitting with you virtually, talking about this topic, inshallah, soon in person. I think as much as we've enjoyed these online virtual discussions, I think we miss the in-person. So much to say about this topic, but to summarize it again, to encourage people that it takes such courage to come and speak out and speak up and share your stories. And I encourage, again, those who have experienced any type of abuse to reach out to either the Sheikh or myself, and we will do our best to support and help you and also refer you to specialists. I don't do private counseling as I work full time. And so I get a lot of demand of people who request the counseling personally, but I do have a list of Muslim Shia counselors and counselors of other backgrounds as well. I'd be more than happy to personally connect people with. I think it is really important when we talk about such sensitive topics, like the Sheikh said, that we open it up, right? That we begin by starting the conversation. And inshallah, we've done a good job of that tonight, of talking about it from the Islamic psycho-spiritual perspective, the psychosocial perspective as well, to talking about something that is so sensitive that normally we would never talk about. Inshallah, this can also begin to allow people to recognize certain not symptoms per se, but to be able to recognize, to identify what spiritual abuse is if it is occurring, and to know who to go to. Like we said, go to your local representative, go to somebody that can follow up with the problem, with the issue, to help you with that. And again, like we said, please don't be shy. Recognize that it can be a sensitive issue and topic. And I guess, we've heard it all, so to speak. And we'd like to be there at your service to help you, inshallah.
Thank you both for those very beautiful final remarks. And thank you to Shaykh Faiyaz and Sister Berak for gracing us with all of your presence and wisdom. Inshallah, I pray that each member of the audience was able to take away at least something from our discussion. And thank you to each one of you for joining us. And I'll keep you all in my duas. And you can stay updated with our programming via I.M.A.M social media platforms. And unless anyone had anything else to add, thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.